For today's session, I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Frits Pannekoek, the President of Athabasca University, Canada, with his presentation on open access and public policy. I will now turn the mic over to Dr. Pannekoek to begin today's session. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for organizing this and for giving me an opportunity to share some of my thoughts. I trust that everybody can hear and that the audio is clear. We did check it earlier. What I wanted to talk about today is really, yes, open access and public policy, and particularly how that is manifested in what I call the information industries. And universities are one of the information industries or post-secondary learning. What I want to talk about is how open source, open access, open educational resources, massively online courses, how all of these and all the other manifestations of openness are impacting the world. As a university administrator and a person interested in public policy, I'm particularly interested in business modeling and how we can continue and embed the open movement within the business plans of institutions. The open movement is, of course, very much pressed by UNESCO, and we should understand why they're so interested in this. Just one sentence alone should help. Is currently we have about 150 million students enrolled in post-secondaries on the globe. We want to increase that, or UNESCO does, by 300 million to 300 million within the next decade or so. The only way that can be done is through the open movement and all its manifestations, including the open university movement. So what is happening as the open movement becomes more ingrained? Well, the first thing I want to look at, because I'm quite interested in it, is in the information industries. I should confess that I should reveal all of my interests. I'm the president of the Canadian Association of Learned Journals, or CALJ as it's known. So I've been spending some of my time recently within Ottawa and elsewhere talking to senior policymakers about what is happening. Now, many of you know that the newspaper industry, for example, that used to be print, moving digital, was moving to open access and is now moving to a more toll-gated environment. That in fact many of the newspaper companies have gone under. Recently I was in Asia, and there's considerable worry about what will happen to print in the next while and what will be the business model. We don't really know entirely what a successful business model will be. I'm looking at also at obviously learned journals. In Canada, there's been considerable government investment in moving learned journals from print to digital. The great question is then, how do you sustain digital journals? One of the attempts that have been made by some universities, particularly Athabasca, is to try to move towards spending 1% of a university's resources on scholarly communication. And I use that word very carefully because it might be journals, it might be video, it might manifest itself in any form of digitally supported technology. The trouble as we move learned journals online, we haven't quite figured out exactly how they should be aggregated. Though there's some aggregations taking place, we haven't quite figured out how smaller journals will maintain citation indices, etc., etc. It's quite complex. So at Athabasca University, what we did in order to determine what a business model might look like and to determine perhaps what policies institutions and government might put in place to support scholarly communication or the communication of scholarly information, is establish an open access press in which everything is online and is free. Anything obviously you want print on demand, you pay for. What we found within a year, that 18% of revenues from the press actually comes from the aggregation of free product by e-aggregators. So the real question is, who's buying the materials? Why are they buying it in the form that they are doing? And if open and free journals have a market value, then who in the business world would be interested in their aggregation and acquisition? Because in a fragile economic situation, that's exactly what will happen. And indeed, in Canada, that is happening. There are about 500 social science and humanities journals, maybe 300 to 400 science journals. What happened is the federal government in the science journals did turn them free and put them into the marketplace. The acquisition by international interests is beginning. Again, open access, in some cases toll gated. Our social science and humanities journals are also being aggregated by external interests and often through ownership. So the digital world has resulted in a, a way to make money off of journals, but those who are making the money tend to be external to the country and have significant resources. One of the things that has become obvious in the digital world is that, as I call it, the N, the number, the volume is absolutely critical. If you are a country with 100 journals, your ability to play in the business environment is minimal. If you have 5,000 journals, your ability to play is much, much, much larger. So what I see in public policy is the need for the nation state to determine whether ownership of its digital information matters at all. Should we in fact be concerned about what's happening? Should we develop some national policies re-ownership? And I've been trying to get the federal government to use their power to convene, to get the key interests together, to have a national discussion on scholarly communication. And that leads us to another, what I call industry, although it's may not be liked to be called an industry, is the world's libraries, who have led the open movement. Is if there is one place, and I know many libraries would disagree, where there is an aggregation of money which can drive new digital environments, it's actually out of libraries. So I still believe that libraries are a key, absolutely key and foundational player. But I find equally interesting the open educational resource movement, where people are decrying the fact the use isn't as great as it might be. I think one of the great mistakes is the OER movement, which is often funded by government, that the OER movement isn't necessarily driven by national policies that would relate it to information sharing policies and policies that underlie the funding of libraries, which are absolutely critical. So I'm interested in all of this this stuff and what's happening. Well, if we move from the general information industries and the fact that we don't have the business models sorted out universally, and that government doesn't really know what policies to put in place to drive business solutions, we should look at universities. But before we do that, I think I'd like to tell one story. There is a company that actually has figured out the open paradigm and what's happening. They do publish open journals. They publish infinitely more toll-gated journals and textbooks, and have figured out in the digital world you may be able to give the information out, but you're going to charge for tutorial support or knowledge support for your particular book or textbook, then you can always get that information freely online, although under Creative Commons you might have to pay a nominal amount for it. So you have some industries that are moving down the road of mediated information and validated information. What I said to the CEO of one of the companies is, well, yeah, you seem to have it all under control, except you can't do credentialing. Aha, she said, but we can because we have simply acquired a whole suite of private colleges. So then you have an information company that's become a learning company that aggregates information which is largely free, even though it's subject to Creative Commons, and moving into a learning environment in which they may undertake credentialing for a fee. So that then moves us with the private sector having figured some of that out, and whether that is sustainable or not is a different issue. Well, what about universities? The open movement, what really is happening there? Well, George Siemens has very, I think, cleverly articulated what's happening is that in universities where information used to be validated and controlled by its libraries, by its professors, and that the students' acquisition of knowledge was then validated and validated through degrees. Well, what's happening now? Well, the information is widely available through open source everywhere. So who's aggregating that information into learning opportunities? Well, universities should be doing that, but individuals are doing it, companies are doing it, all types of digital information purveyors are doing it. People are doing it as a volunteer activity and putting it online, in some cases as OERs. So is the validation of that knowledge any more important than it was in the past? Well, I would argue it's as important, and perhaps that is where universities may well have a role, but various other peoples will have that role as well. So then when you look at universities as to perhaps harvesting information, validating that information through their collections, which libraries still do, and through professors creating courses, but those courses could be online anywhere. Okay, then what happens? Well, the only role left for a university is the validation of knowledge and perhaps the credentialing of knowledge, but why couldn't anyone else do that? And in fact, that's what's happening internationally. Universities are no longer the only validators. Some MOOCs, in some MOOCs, the certificate or badge program is another approach of some form of validation. But in the end, you can see where this might be heading. It's what should a government do? What should a university do? What should provincial ministries of education do? What are their roles? What policies should be in place to ensure that if universities have validity, that they continue? Who is going to pay for, and this is one of the problems I have in my head all the time, who is going to pay the faculty salaries? For example, let's say we go entirely into an OER-driven institution. And I have had ministries throughout the world, and I'm very fortunate to meet people in all sorts of countries where they say OERs are absolutely wonderful. We love OERs, open educational resources, because it means we don't have to have as many faculty members. We don't have to spend part of our national treasure, i.e. money, budget, on faculty, which are seen to be very expensive. You even have the interest in the United States as why is there such an interest in public policy and funding OERs? It's because there is a belief it can be lower cost, and lower cost because there is less investment in intellectual property. So the real issue around the world is how do we ensure that IP is supported, and I'd not say paid for, is supported. how do we ensure that policies are there in society to ensure that, I call it smart people, are compensated for their wisdom? We haven't actually clearly figured that one out yet. There is an estimate in the Chronicle of Higher Education that with OERs in the open movement, some smaller institutions and colleges may well collapse. It may be that brands matter more than they ever have before. Anyway, some of these issues bother me and require public policy. But around the world, what is happening? Well, around the world at the moment, governments are reacting to the open movement and all of that it stands for by increasing regulation. One country, for example, says that an open university and distance learning should not be allowed until, by any institution, until it's been operating as a traditional institution for a 5-year period. Another country has said, well, yes, we may well want an open university based on open source, open access, and all this stuff. However, that anybody who has graduated from an open institution will never be allowed to move into a residential institution, no matter what their credential or background is. We have other institutions that say, yes, we believe in the open movement, we believe in OER, we believe in open universities, we believe in the removal of barriers to learning, which all this openness allows. However, all learning, 80% of all learning must be in classrooms. So what we have around the globe happening is a defensive set of policies that mitigate against let's say, global activity in the open movement. And I actually do despair considerably about this. I've seen in the last 5 years increasing public policies that mitigate against removal of barriers to learning. For example, and I'll use one very explicit example, in the United States under the Higher Education, under HERA, the Higher Education Reconciliation Act. Under that act, American government money cannot be used by an American citizen to take a course from a foreign distance provider. So in other words, an open university like Athabasca devoted to a certain style of learning, an open style of learning that is digital in its entirety, those students in the US could not get government monies to take any courses. Other nation states are doing that. Indeed, in Canada, the province Quebec has similar rules. So while we may have open educational resources, we may be able to actually offer courses. We may actually be able to internationalize using this technology. Unfortunately, what I've found is an increasing restriction. The noose is tightening almost daily. I know that the International Council of Distance Education is very concerned about this and has commissioned a study, sample study in a part of the world to determine the nature of those restrictions. What we're also trying to do with the nature of those restrictions when we determine what they are is work with those countries to figure out alternate policy initiatives that would allow the citizens of the country access to open learning resources at the same time to allow some kind of quality framework so that the validation of the learning those people might be taking that validation can be achieved either by national accrediting bodies, i.e. universities, or by international accrediting bodies, i.e. universities. So we're still a long way away from seeing any ubiquitous accreditation of open sourced learning. It's not to say it's not going to happen. I'm saying it will take some time. If you're watching, and it's worthy, watching universities who are attempting to move either what I call in an open online environment, some of them are starting to pull back because they don't have a business model. There's a case in the States of a university that made a commitment to online learning. Some of it, they were producing some of their own online open access materials, and their calculations were they would need around 6,000 or 7,000 students when they opened in order to drive the business case. They would have to actually charge for this. They couldn't manage that as of one issue ago, and it'll be interesting to see if the university without the business case is going to shut down its activities. Currently, when the major universities put stuff online, there are several motives for doing it, and they are, to a degree, policy driven at a very senior level. We know that when courses go online, let's say the MIT courses or those from various American institutions, often faculty members spend a lot of time working on them, an incredible amount of time to make them production worthy. And so the learning within the classrooms at their host institution also significantly improves. So it builds brand, it improves teaching, but we still haven't figured out how we manage things beyond those environments. MOOCs are increasingly interesting, and I'm a strong supporter of them. And we've had conversations at our university, but we haven't figured out the business case. And in most cases, they're seen as a faculty activity that's to be endorsed or returned to community. But there are some universities, 3 or 4, that are now beginning to accredit certain MOOCs. That is, they will give credit for them. And it'll be interesting to see whether any institution would give an entire degree based on MOOC, some form of MOOC certification. And most important of all, because this has not happened yet, and I am concerned about this, when the quality, the national, state, and or provincial quality councils start to become involved in accreditation reviews and whether the MOOCs will stand up to scrutiny. This concerns me quite a lot, actually. There's several other things that are happening, and so we can talk about all the policy issues, et cetera, but the question I've posed to many of the people I know is, okay, we have to assume that there's a radical change happening, an incredible change happening. So let's invent the university of the future. What will universities and post-secondary learning look like, let's say, 25 years from now? That's for that generations of scholars that's entering the new environment. So what will that university look like? What will the government policies be and should be to encourage that university? So I'll ask some questions. Will those universities be sole credentialing agents, or will universities also monitor the credentialing and examinations of private sector organizations to certain standards? Do universities have to be the only one who credential? And if that happens, what will happen to that environment we currently know as a university? Another question I have, because this is another part of the open movement, we're all building free textbooks of some kind, and that if we had our way, all textbooks at post-secondaries, particularly in large courses, would all be based on a free model. But is that sustainable? Is it expected that the state would pay? Is it expected that we would develop an interesting and different business model? A business gentleman that I know quite well thinks he could make money out of free textbooks. What he would do is 80% of much knowledge in certain disciplines, let's say engineering, is common throughout the North America. So if you were a company, you could say, I will give away 80% of it for free, but 20% since it has to be customized, I will charge for. Now you have to have a very large N of thousands and thousands and thousands of students. That is a possibility. The businessman also said he would encourage advertising in text in those free textbooks. And I heard when I suggested that gasps by a number of people who said, well, we can't have advertising in textbooks. Well, the advertising he was proposing was, let's say we have a first-year engineering textbook and we have one of the oil sands company who desperately needs engineers is simply saying when you graduate there are 500 jobs available. So it's motivational advertising. Business model had been carefully developed. It is possible to do it and make it pay to some degree. Do we want to go down that route? Is that an appropriate route to go? Then if universities don't exist in their current form, how will the authors of the textbooks be compensated? Today, many it's that professors are the ones that write the textbooks and they're paid through a different form. So how is that all going to work? The next is when you have, another question I have is when you have learners who need supports in their learning, because everyone learns differently, who will tutor / teach? Who will offer that support? It could be individuals on their own, the individual entrepreneur. It could be the university that is ultimately responsible for credentialing, having guides to help through the learning materials. It could be the textbook producers that do the tutoring of the materials that are adopted at institutions. But again, what's the business plan? If there's no institution as we know it today, how will that work? Will that be based on micropayments of millions of students? So we haven't actually answered that question, but it's a question that we've got to wrap our heads around. The next question I have is the fourth question. It's on what I call learning analytics, the great new movement that will have considerable impact on the open, what I call the open world, people advocating open source, open access, OERs, MOOCs, etc., is as learning analytics become more sophisticated, we will in fact be able to determine how students are in real time learning a concept, what the obstacles to learning that concept might be, and then refining the course to do that. If we ever have the sophistication that learning analytics has a potential to offer and embed those learning analytics in courses, we would have an incredible new generation of learning opportunities that may in fact negate the need for tutors and in-class teaching or may assist it. We simply don't know enough yet, but we do know that within a 25-year period, learning analytics will be everywhere and will significantly change how we learn, the speed at which we learn, the pace at which we learn, and the ability to self-learn. What will that do to institutions? How will that play into the accreditation process if that still exists? Then another activity that a university is known for and that many are now turning to for key revenue is research. Should research at universities be a revenue center? Should research also be part of the open movement. It currently, we advocate it is, because the argument is if the public pays for research through research grants, it should be available at no cost to the public who paid for it. Don't disagree, but again, as a person responsible for meeting a monthly salary bill, exactly how will that work? Will it stop private interest in partnering with universities simply because of the pressures to release IP perhaps before value has been extracted? So we have to worry about that a lot. The other element of universities I worry about, and this is perhaps not as big a worry, is the whole issue of the service obligations of universities. I would argue that, and generally in North American universities, it's a third, a third, a third. A third research, a third teaching, a third community service. One could argue that open source, open access, OERs are all part of the service of institutions to the wider community. But I think, to be blunt, that is a bit on the naive side, because this service is now driving all parts of the business of the university. Again, how are we going to meet the obligations? Some people would say that those service obligations should be met by government and the state. Well, in parts of the United States and increasingly in parts of Canada, state contributions is significantly diminished and is going down to perhaps 10-15% at best. I know some public institutions have even less than that. So you're in an environment of being regulated and an environment in which public service is expected, but having to figure out how revenues might be generated to sustain the institution. I have various other observations as well, some of which I will share and some of them I'll just leave you to imagine. What I see happening is the rise of the academic. The academic has always in a university been, some people argue, an entrepreneur surrounded with supports so that they can explore the best way to serve students in their society and their discipline. Well, increasingly, as the obligations are downloaded on the academic, open source, open access, MOOC courses, etc., you will see, I believe, the rise of the academic as entrepreneur and manager rather than knowledge creator and teacher, simply because the obligations to be that entrepreneur will increasingly focus on the academic. Some institutions in North America already have, and supported by government policy, some of the institutions actually have policies in place that obligate a professor to generate his own revenue. They are on what is called contingent tenure. You have tenure provided you can raise your own salary through your entrepreneurial and/or granting activities. Maybe that's the way it should be. Anyway, I posed all these questions because the open world is an increasingly exciting one, a increasingly interesting one, an increasingly destabilizing one. And to think that the institutions we work for will always be there in their current form, I actually believe is a tad naive, looking what's happening at newspapers and others. There is a dramatic shift happening. Will it shake up the great institutions of the world like the Harvards and the Cambridges and the Oxfords and the Imperial Colleges? Possibly not. Will it shake up the very foundations internationally of the mass learning movement? Yes, it definitely will. Could it result, because of government policy, in a two-tier system, the elite education for those who will govern and mass education for those who will be governed? That's one of my great fear. I tend to start seeing that happening. Because what I perceive happening through international and national regulation, if you look carefully at why are all these regulations, why are these new policies restricting massification of learning, why are they so evident and increasingly evident? I think, frankly, it's to preserve the class system that universities have created. That is, universities do create an elite, whether it's an intelligentsia, whether it's the people who populate our parliaments and our governing structures. Yes, they do. And when you see the massification of learning, doubling the number of people, the pressures on the existing middle classes to compete will be greater and greater and greater. I mean, the jobs will be more and more and more, but there'll also be significant class and economic pressures. So I think that the changing regulatory environment I see is one that is reacting in a very conservative way to the opportunities that the open movement offers. I hope that we all become very conscious of these new policies. I hope we work within our provincial, state, and national governments to ensure that barriers to open access aren't insidiously created. In fact, in some cases, we might even inadvertently support them. So I would encourage everyone to become knowledgeable about what's happening in their jurisdictions, to also become knowledgeable about the business frameworks that we also have an obligation to put together, because I believe in the end we all believe in sharing knowledge. We all believe that everyone's a lifelong learner, and we also believe in some way that we should have some form of accrediting, credentialing, evaluating learning and knowledge. So I leave these thoughts with you, and delighted to attempt to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you very much for that excellent presentation, Dr. Pannekoek. I'm going to start from the beginning with some of the questions that have been collected. We'll go back to Donna. Donna, would you please elaborate on the concerns of state accreditation processes of universities delivering for credit MOOCs, please?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, that'd be great. Thanks very much.
Okay. I think what will happen is I do not believe that the state ought to accredit individual courses. They accredit programs and degrees. They do it in the states through the regional accreditation associations, and you undergo these incredible reviews. We've gone through one in the province, let's say, of Alberta. We actually have a quality council that assesses programs and degrees. So the big issue is if you have very traditional voices on some of these accreditation bodies and your university evaluated very carefully this MOOC, you can actually look at the learning, you can record the learning, you can validate the learning, then why wouldn't and shouldn't you be able to do it? I will guarantee you that that is going to be a difficulty in many jurisdictions. In 2 U.S. states, I believe their universities are already crediting single MOOCs. Now, I noticed that someone's asked, how would you elaborate, how would you determine whether someone had learned anything? Well, believe it or not, there are companies that actually do security rated exams, will develop the exam with an institution, and could actually examine a person to determine exactly whether the learning was in place or not. And so you actually have a situation where, yeah, the exam is done by a private sector company at low cost, and the institution, after having vetted and gone into contract with that company, is actually prepared then to validate it. So are there ways of ensuring identity, detailed examinations, etc.? Yeah. There's another company in a North American-based company, for example, that does testing that actually tests the depth of knowledge. So it's not the knowledge on the course. Let's say in calculus, it would be, did you learn the course material, obviously, but how deep is your entire knowledge in the field? That's huge for the planning of learning, and those forms of exams are already available. So we have private sector involved in examination. Now the issue I can see, some of the chat people will say, how do you know it's the appropriate exam and all the rest? Well, the university and its academics will ensure that. The question is, how far do you want to go down that road, and what kind of policies ought to be in place? Currently, it's a bit of a vacuum.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to go back to another earlier question that came from Tony, and Tony would like to know what will be the role of the academic library in the future, given the rise of OER, OA, and MOOCs?
I actually believe that the academic library has a greater future than possibly anyone even in the libraries believe. The amount of information is so great that, and if you believe the numbers, 2 million OERs, for example, floating out there. If I were a faculty member, I'd say, yeah, I want to get involved in this, but my God, there's so much stuff. I've only got a lifetime. How can I get this stuff? The role that libraries used to play was the collection of validated material. They didn't acquire everything. They actually had filters of various kinds. Maybe what has to happen is that the academic library has to be a first filter of what is academically appropriate. Doesn't mean that, cyber world shouldn't have a gazillion things out there. It's, if you want a trusted collection, you would say, well, the academic library at, let's say, University of Calgary, for example, they really know more about, let's say, music than any other library. If you want to have the best collection of MOOCs or the best collection of X, Y, or Z, you would go to that library. Or if you were interested in medical information, it may be that the best stuff is collected out of some big American university. So you may see the increasing specialization of academic libraries. Are they there in doing this at the moment? Not entirely. There is another sector involved in the validation of information, and that, the private sector or e-aggregators. I would hope that at some point, let's say all the academic libraries in Canada or North America would get together and say, we are going to do the aggregation and the validation. Currently, a lot of private sector companies are doing that, and then libraries buy the stuff from the private sector saying, yeah, this is a good company that does good work, so we're acquiring their pool of stuff. Are they as active as they might be in the OERs? No, I know they're active, but I've been pushing the OER movement saying, if your stuff isn't used, it's because it's not validated. And one of the process of validation is having it collected in the library. So anyway, that's some. So I believe libraries have a very, very critical role, academic libraries.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Frits. I'm just going to interrupt. We have a few more questions, but I just wanted to announce the draw winners for today. And if you can please email me your information, I will be able to get it. And today it's Sam and also Louise Garduama. Please send me your emails, and we will send the door prizes, the virtual door prizes, out to you. So back to questions. We have one from Stephanie here asking, can you say why the open movement is focused on tertiary rather than secondary or primary education?
It actually is focused on all. In the province of Alberta, the first real OER movement was amongst the K to 12. The reason that the K to 12 you will see is not as much in evidence is one, there is a belief that we have to protect the minds of our of younger learners, and departments of education are very, very concerned, as are schools, about what they allow in. There's also greater control over curriculum in the K to 12. I mean, you have generally state indicate exactly what the learning outcomes would be. So you're going to be very, very, very careful as to what you use. Also, you don't have as much time to plan your lessons. You're under the gun, and you have a very prescribed curriculum. That's not the case in the post-secondary. So that's why I believe, to a degree, the OER movement tends to be much stronger in the post-secondary environment, but it's also much stronger in the universities than it is in the technical institutes, although that is changing rapidly.
Thank you. We have another question here from Caroline, who'd like to know, will it become important to obtain practitioner insurance as education becomes more business model prone?
That's a really interesting question. I suspect at some point it's people who are responsible, or institutions responsible for accrediting. They have been sued in the US for failure to educate, failure to create literacy, and all the rest of it. That wouldn't surprise me. Now, I'm not suggesting that universities should become more like a business. I actually think learning is not a business. But as the business model, and I use the word business, small b business model, or the economic model for post-secondary, comes under stress, we will see parts of it grabbed, particularly the profitable parts, by the corporate sector, as you would expect. So you will have increasing stresses. You will have universities perhaps being too looked at as a business, and should they practitioners have insurance? I personally think it might be useful, but we're not there, and hopefully we won't be there, but who knows?
Excellent, thank you. I've got 3 more questions so far collected from chat. The next one is a comment, as well as a couple of questions on the end from Hongjing Yan. While we are seeking for a complete business model-based OER, we can definitely use OER materials and validated by the academics in order to reduce the cost of course development. So just in that sense, I'm thinking OER should be greatly encouraged at present. What are the reactions of the academics on adopting OER versus third-party materials, and would there be more work for them if they were using OERs?
Well, in theory, if OERs are carefully developed, an academic can develop their own course and their own OER and share it with others. The idea is not to take an OER and use it, entirely. It's to say, here is something that's interesting, it's ready for the use in learning. I think I'll use part of it, all of it, or none of it. So I think that there is a belief that OER materials will reduce costs, and they will, because you don't have the copyright costs involved. However, if you think it through, if you also mean that if we do OERs, we need fewer academics, we need fewer course designers, we need fewer of everything, and we're going to reduce our costs by, quote, dumbing down the academy. That is in no one's interests, and I deplore anything that would lead to that. So I think we're very, very careful. Yes, you should use the best materials in learning, whether it's a textbook or an OER, but I always emphasize it must be the best material. I would argue, if I were a student, if the OER is the best, and many of them are the best, we must use those. If there is another form of information that has a toll gate on it, and it is the very best, we should use the very best. And I think you'll find institutions going for the very best. But we have to be very, very, very careful. I've had too many senior people in government ministries abroad, particularly in developing countries, saying to me, yes, this is going to be low cost. We don't need as many academics. I'm saying, yes, you do. You do need a community of learners. You need people interacting with each other. So we do need a certain density of academics in order to make anything work.
Okay, excellent. And I do have one final question here from Pauline. One of the key roles of academia is knowledge generation and sharing. Don't you think that this new trend towards faculty entrepreneurs is worrying and a threat to the traditional role of knowledge creation?
I do, and that's one of my very, very great concerns. When, for example, our universities approach, which sometimes it is, will you just let us use your curriculum in another country with another culture? I always say, are you sure you really want to do that? Aren't you really as interested in making sure the culture that you and your institutions represent is really dominant? So I think the role of knowledge creation has always been paid for by the state, by the students, by wealthy donors. I mean, you can argue that. Well, as we move to an environment of disintegration of information, providers like universities used to do it, newspapers used to do it, journals used to do it. Now it's single entrepreneurs. Like I was asked by a very senior person in one of Canada's granting councils, is like, why do you care? Surely the individual scholar just puts his stuff up. If it's any good, people will just go ahead. It's a free-for-all now. I'd say, okay. But do you understand how the citation business works? Do you understand how the validation of knowledge works? Do you understand any of that? Well, they didn't. That was a mystery that libraries more or less have kept. So I'm thinking that we haven't disaggregated the value chain. We don't understand the value chain in its entirety. We haven't thought about how the open movement is going to play out. And the open movement will have many unintended consequences. We all are part of it because we believe in sharing. We believe in the very best. We believe that if we have a good idea, we must share it and should share it. And that's good and right, and I'm part of that. But what are the unintended consequences of a total disaggregation of information provision to validation of learning? What is going to happen to this? And I think that conversation has to happen. It just has to happen, and we have to be very serious about it. And that's the question I keep asking everyone. It's what is your model for making this work? Given all the inputs from politicians to private sector to academics to learning support folks to the learners themselves, and we must not be short-sighted. And I think sometimes we are just a tad short-sighted, whether we're OER supporters, whether we're policy makers, whether we're university administrators. We have to think 25 to 50 years out. And that's my plea to everyone, really.
Okay, it looks like that could have been the last of our questions. So I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Pannekoek, for an excellent and informative presentation. This presentation and others will be made available on the Open Access Week website. We will be here all week. Our noon hour presentations will continue until Friday. Please join us here tomorrow and for the rest of the week. Thank you very much and have a good day. Goodbye.